The moment the doors opened in Busan, it wasn't diplomacy, it was surrender in slow motion. Trump walked in talking about victory, and Xi walked out owning the outcome. Tariffs dropped, soybeans traded hands, and the world's balance quietly tilted east. Because while Washington talked about deals, Beijing had already built a new financial system, rewired global trade, and turned America's pressure into its own power. What happened in that room didn't reset the trade war. It revealed who was really in charge. According to Bloomberg's readout, China characterized the outcome as a stabilization gesture, whereas the White House called it the first step toward equilibrium. Yet beneath the carefully worded statements, the geopolitical balance looked unmistakably altered. The Financial Times noted that for the first time in over a decade, Beijing dictated the pace and framing of negotiations. Xi's delegation arrived with prepared data, forecasts, and counteroffers, and Trump's team largely reacted rather than initiated. The visible contrast between the two leaders underscored a deeper shift. Trump, animated and emphatic, leaned toward the cameras, declaring that he rated the talks 12 out of 10. Xi remained reserved, his expression unreadable. State media in Beijing described him as patient and principled, a tone signaling quiet confidence. The Wall Street Journal pointed out that China's latest economic indicators offered context. Its GDP, measured in purchasing power terms, continued to exceed that of the United States, and new IMF projections for 2025 showed China contributing 34% of global growth, nearly triple the U.S. share. That data lent weight to a reality neither leader could escape. China no longer needed to chase concessions. Its manufacturing rebound, confirmed by October PMI readings from the National Bureau of Statistics, reached 50.7, its strongest expansion since 2022. Exports to Southeast Asia and the Middle East offset losses to the US and Europe. In short, Beijing had diversified away from dependency on Western markets just as Washington's tariffs peaked. Trump's concessions reflected that imbalance. The rollback of the so-called 50% rule, a sanctions measure blacklisting over 20,000 Chinese firms from Western finance, effectively reopened access to dollar clearing through Hong Kong subsidiaries. Analysts from Citigroup told Bloomberg that this alone could unlock more than $180 billion in suspended cross-border credit lines within months. The White House presentation framed it as reciprocity for China pausing rare earth export controls. Yet Beijing's statement conspicuously omitted any reference to such a pause, suggesting that Washington's interpretation might have been optimistic at best. The FT observed that rare earth flows through Baotou and Guangzhou ports had already stabilized in late September, independent of U.S. pressure. Customs data showed shipments rising 8.3% month-on-month, a sign that China was managing supply in its own interest, not America's. By agreeing to nothing specific, Xi retained leverage while appearing conciliatory, a hallmark of Beijing's negotiating style since the 2020 Phase 1 deal. Beyond trade, the Busan meeting touched a volatile frontier maritime access. A joint communiqué confirmed that both sides would suspend new port fees and sanctions on each other's shipping industries. That decision, Bloomberg reported, averted a brewing crisis after the United States Commerce Department had considered restricting Chinese shipbuilders' access to American ports. China's Transport Ministry, in turn, paused retaliatory levies on United States vessels in the South China Sea. This temporary détente calmed freight markets but left strategic waters as contested as ever. Within hours of the announcement, the Shanghai Composite rose 2.6%, led by logistics firms and state banks. In New York, semiconductor stocks initially rallied before flattening once analysts recognized the narrow scope of the deal. The Wall Street Journal quoted Neil Shearing, chief economist at Capital Economics, saying the meeting underscored asymmetry. The United States needed a truce for political optics. China wanted time. That distinction mattered. Trump, eyeing re-election momentum, sought relief for United States farmers and manufacturers suffering from retaliatory tariffs. Xi, facing slowing property investment, prioritized stability ahead of the 2026 National People's Congress. By mid-October, China's fiscal response appeared coordinated. The finance ministry announced 1.5 trillion yuan, about $206 billion, in new infrastructure bonds, much of it earmarked for domestic tech supply chains and energy transition projects, the same sectors Washington had tried to curtail. Bloomberg Intelligence noted that this stimulus would offset nearly 70% of the drag from foreign export losses. In effect, Beijing was cushioning external pressure through internal reallocation. Trump's advisors privately conceded to Reuters that the United States sought stabilization before escalation, but stabilization required leverage, and that leverage was fading. Since 2023, China has signed or expanded over $500 billion in swap and settlement lines through its cross-border interbank payment system, reducing dollar exposure. IMF data shows that the yuan now accounts for 5.8% of global reserves, up from 2.5% 5 years earlier. That still trails the dollar by a wide margin, yet the trajectory demonstrates structural change. The broader implication is strategic rather than symbolic. When Trump entered office again in 2025, Washington's assumption was that tariffs could coerce Beijing into compliance. 2 years on, the data suggests otherwise. Chinese trade with BRICS partners now exceeds its combined trade with the United States and the European Union, crossing $1.35 trillion by August, according to China's Customs Administration. That diversification has dulled United States pressure. The WTO's September figures show Asia's intra-regional trade reaching 62% of total flows, the highest in modern history, effectively creating an alternative network beyond Western oversight. Inside the Busan summit, officials debated whether a Phase 2 deal could ever exist. Bloomberg reported that the Chinese side rejected the term outright, calling it anachronistic. Instead, Beijing proposed a parallel stability mechanism, periodic reviews without conditions. Trump agreed in principle, but insisted it be reciprocal. The language difference really captured the moment. Washington was negotiating frameworks, while Beijing was defining architecture. A subtle but telling episode followed. Reuters photographers noted that when the leaders exited the hall, Trump reached out for a handshake first. Xi hesitated, adjusted his cuff, then extended his hand briefly before turning toward his delegation. Observers from the South Korean Foreign Ministry described it as protocol executed without sentiment. Body language often deceives, but symbolism, really matters in diplomacy, and the symbolism pointed to composure on one side, performative urgency on the other. The domestic reactions mirrored that divide. In Beijing, state television led with the phrase, mutual respect under change. In Washington, networks framed it as China wins pause on tariffs. The disparity reflected different political needs. Trump emphasizing temporary relief for United States farmers and manufacturers, Xi highlighting continuity of China's rise. The Financial Times editorial board concluded that power has shifted not through confrontation but through persistence. That endurance, methodical, bureaucratic, cumulative, is what gives Beijing confidence to wait. Several Western analysts echoed that view. George Magnus of the University of Oxford told Bloomberg that China's strategy is attritional. It wins by refusing urgency. Meanwhile, Liz Ann Saunders at Charles Schwab warned on CNBC that prolonged uncertainty could depress United States business investment by up to 1.2 percentage points in 2026 if tariffs linger. By contrast, China's industrial output, boosted by state credit lines and BRICS-based demand, grew 6.5% year-on-year in September, according to the National Bureau of Statistics. Amid these divergences, one shared vulnerability remains: technology. The partial lifting of export restrictions still leaves Huawei, Nvidia, and Xperia entangled in national security reviews. Reuters confirmed that U.S. officials privately asked Beijing to limit AI chip exports to Russia, but no public statement followed. That silence suggests tacit defiance. If China continues deepening its semiconductor partnerships with Malaysia and Saudi Arabia, as Bloomberg reported this week, Washington's containment strategy could erode faster than anticipated. And yet, the tone in Busan never tipped into confrontation. Xi told Trump that frictions are normal for two leading economies, repeating a phrase from Deng Xiaoping-era diplomacy. Trump replied that we're competitors, not enemies. For observers accustomed to volatility, this moderation felt almost surreal. But behind the calm was calculation. China's foreign exchange reserves stand at $3.24 trillion per the People's Bank of China October release. 21 times larger than the U.S. Exchange Stabilization Fund that Scott Bessent, Treasury Secretary, oversees. The numbers alone describe the asymmetry. One side defends a currency, the other defends an order. For all the ceremony, the Busan meeting's real significance lies in what wasn't said. Neither side mentioned Taiwan. Neither discussed digital currency interoperability, despite ongoing pilot projects between China's PBOC and Singapore's Monetary Authority. Instead, the emphasis stayed narrow: agriculture, shipping, and tariffs. By limiting scope, Xi ensured no new vulnerabilities opened. Trump, in focusing on soybean optics, tacitly acknowledged the electoral necessity of stability over strategy. The question, therefore, is not whether China won the meeting, but, what victory actually means in 2025. Winning now seems to require less confrontation and more endurance. China's share of global manufacturing output has risen to 31%, according to UNIDO, while the United States' share has fallen below 16. Beijing's Belt and Road loans, often criticized as risky, now carry default rates lower than U.S. corporate junk bonds, according to an October report by Boston University's Global Development Policy Center. These metrics define influence more effectively than speeches. As markets digested the Busan outcome, bond yields told a quieter story. U.S. 10-year treasuries briefly climbed above 4.9% on inflation fears before retreating, while China's 10-year government bond stayed anchored below 2%. Capital flowed toward predictability. That differential, not tariffs, not rhetoric, may explain why global investors now treat Beijing's policymaking as the stabilizer in an otherwise uncertain world. No grand declaration ended the summit, just two signatures, a partial rollback, and a shared nod toward future cooperation. But as one FT correspondent observed from the press pit, the choreography said enough. The world's two largest economies stood together, yet the center of gravity had moved. The applause sounded polite, not expectant. And somewhere between Trump's bravado and Xi's restraint, it became clear that power no longer announces itself. It accumulates quietly until, well, everyone realizes it's already shifted. We're glad you're enjoying this video. Please like and subscribe. Check out another video that is now on your screen.